systems thinking is a mental framework that can help you absorb real-time feedback, adapt on the go, and work consistently towards your goals. In order to understand how we can implement this in our own lives, we are going to talk about Operation Raspberry. Operation Raspberry is an incredible true story from World War II. It's a story where a dude with tuberculosis and a secret unit of young women developed a system that helped protect Britain's most vital supply lines and blunt one of Hitler's deadliest attacks. The cool part is, they did all of this from a building in Liverpool without ever setting a foot on the battlefield. Let's get started. Our story begins in 1942. By this time, Hitler had gained control over most of Western Europe apart from one very stubborn exception, Britain. Germany had failed to win the air superiority required for an invasion during the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe then continued bombing British towns and cities during the infamous Blitz, but a full-scale ground invasion remained extraordinarily difficult. But at the same time, Germany had been pursuing another slower strategy since the beginning of the war: starvation. See, Britain is an island, and being an island is extremely useful when an army is trying to invade you. But it becomes a serious problem when much of your food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials keeping your country alive have to reach you by sea. At the time, Britain required more than 1 million tons of imported supplies every single week. If Hitler could just cut that maritime supply, Britain's ability to continue the war would eventually collapse. To execute this strangulation strategy, Hitler handed the mission to Admiral Karl Donitz, the mastermind behind the German U-boat fleet. Now, a U-boat is just a German term for a submarine. Karl Donitz was a veteran of World War I. That is why he knew exactly what he was up against. During the First World War, German submarines operated mostly as lone hunters. They were deadly at first, but eventually the British figured out a defense: the convoy system. By grouping merchant ships together and surrounding them with heavily armed warships, the Allies easily fought off the lone U-boats. Donitz knew that a single submarine couldn't take on a heavily guarded convoy, so he developed a new technique: the wolfpack. These weren't just 2 or 3 submarines. A wolfpack could consist of up to 20 U-boats spread out over hundreds of miles of ocean like a giant invisible dragnet. Instead of hunting alone, these lines of U-boats would patrol the freezing Atlantic. When one spotted a British supply convoy, it wouldn't attack. It would stay hidden, shadow the ships, and radio the coordinates back to Germany. Donitz would then order every available U-boat in that area to converge on that exact spot. They would wait for the dead of the night and strike all at once as a massive coordinated pack. Now the British Royal Navy had a plan to stop this. Their standard operating procedure dictated exactly what they were supposed to do. See, the British just assumed that the German U-boats were acting like snipers, firing their torpedoes from a safe distance far outside the perimeter of the convoy. So the moment a cargo ship exploded, the British warships would hit full throttle, turn outwards, away from the merchant ships, and race into the dark ocean. Once they reached the outer perimeter, they would drop hundreds of explosive depth charges, hoping to blow up the submarines. But the plan was failing miserably. The British destroyers were blowing up massive stretches of empty ocean, but they were rarely hitting any U-boats. Meanwhile, inside the convoy, supply ships kept blowing up. The wolfpack was so successful that they called this period the Glückliche Zeit, or the happy time. The British government at the time was secretly calculating how many weeks of food they had left. They had tried all their best efforts but were not able to figure out what the Germans were up to. Winston Churchill himself, in one of his memoirs, has written that the only time he was frightened during the war was the U-boat peril. The Navy needed someone to solve this mystery, so they turned to a man named Commander Gilbert Roberts. Commander Roberts was a brilliant naval tactician and wargamer, but he had contracted tuberculosis and was medically prevented from serving at the sea. So in early 1942, the Navy sent him to Derby House, part of the Western Approaches Headquarters complex at Liverpool Exchange Flags. There, Robert was given the top floor, famously known as Room 66, to establish a new tactical unit. His mission was simple: figure out what the Germans were doing and find a way to stop them. But there was a problem. This was 1942 and most experienced naval officers were out at the sea. This is when he turned to the Women's Royal Navy Service, affectionately known as the Wrens. He recruited incredibly sharp young women such as Jean Laidlaw, a 21-year-old Scottish former sea ranger who had worked as an insurance clerk before the war. She would later become a chartered accountant, but at this point, she was helping analyze the world's most dangerous naval campaign. Another member was Janet Ockel, who was only around 19 years old when she joined the unit. Together, Roberts and the Wrens created WATU, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, and what they built in Room 66 wasn't just a war room, it was a system. To begin with, they needed data. That's the first common sense step of creating any system. You can't do anything without first understanding what the hell is going on. So when escort captains returned from the Atlantic to docks in Liverpool, they were immediately brought to Room 66. The Wrens debriefed them, taking their real-world combat reports. Where were you when the ship exploded? Where was the wind blowing? Where did the torpedo strike? They took all this bloody real-world data and used it for step 2. The simulation. The Wrens painted a massive grid on the floor to simulate the attacks as per the captain's debriefs. They used chalk and string to simulate the movement of ships. But this wasn't just a giant board game. It was a rigorous mathematical simulation of reality. Roberts governed the game with strict physics. The ships on the floor could only move at the real-world speeds. The submarines were limited to their actual battery life, and their movement was restricted by their exact turning radiuses. They played the attacks, move by move, meticulously reverse engineering the battles to see exactly what was happening during those encounters. By running this system, Robert and the Wrens quickly realized that the math was simply not adding up. The Navy had always assumed that the U-boats were firing from miles away on the outside of the convoy. But when Jean Laidlaw and the team plotted the exact angles of the torpedo strikes, turning radiuses, and the speeds of submarines, they made a chilling discovery. The torpedoes weren't coming from the outside. The U-boats were inside the convoy. Because submarines sit so low in the water, they were practically invisible at night. Under the cover of darkness, the German U-boats were quickly slipping right between the columns of the British supply ships. They weren't acting like snipers, they were acting like assassins, firing at point-blank range from the center of the fleet. And this is where their system exposed a fatal flaw in the Navy's strategy. See, when a ship exploded, the British escort warships would immediately hit full throttle and race outwards into the empty ocean, dropping depth charges. But the U-boats weren't out there. After firing, the Germans would just dive deep, turn around, and quietly slip out the back of the convoy while the British warships sped away in the opposite directions. The British were literally running away from the enemy. See, now this is the power of systems thinking. When you rely on assumptions, you end up dropping bombs on an empty ocean. But when you actually use systematic thinking and simulations, you figure out the truth. But let's not celebrate prematurely. They haven't proved anything yet. This is just a theory, which brings us to the next step of systems thinking, the testing phase. For days, Roberts, Laidlaw, and the Wrens stayed hunched over the floor at Room 66. They ran simulation after simulation to engineer the perfect counterattack. They called it Operation Raspberry. The mechanics of Raspberry were beautifully simple. Instead of hitting the throttle and racing away into the empty ocean when a ship exploded, the British warships would do the exact opposite. They would immediately fire bright white flares into the sky, turning the pitch black night into a broad daylight. Then the escort ships would turn inward, sweeping backward, directly through the columns of the merchant ships, dropping depth charges as they went. Since their system had already inferred that the U-boats were diving and trying to quietly slip out the back of the convoy, Operation Raspberry essentially dropped a massive inescapable net right across their only escape route. But they didn't just hope this would work. The Wrens tested Raspberry mathematically. Once they were sure about the Raspberry protocol, which again they tested using the same simulation techniques as before, they moved on to the next step of the system, which is execution. The Navy immediately started bringing escort captains to Room 66 to get them trained on the Raspberry protocol. Once they were sufficiently trained, they were sent back to the Atlantic Ocean to execute the protocol, and it was a success. Instead of blowing up the ocean, the British warships actually started targeting the actual German U-boats. The happy times of Germans had hit a roadblock. By replacing assumptions with the reality-tested systems, this top-secret unit had solved the mystery of the U-boat peril. But wait, the wolfpack is called the wolfpack for a reason. They didn't just quietly give up. They came up with a new tactic, a new weapon, called the acoustic torpedo. Instead of aiming straight, these new torpedoes literally listened for the loud churning sound of the British warship's propellers and curved through the water to blow them up from behind. Suddenly, the British escorts started taking heavy hits again. The atmosphere got sad again. But Roberts, Jean Laidlaw, and the Wrens knew the most important rule of systems thinking. A system is never finished. It is a continuous feedback loop. They had never really stopped interviewing the captains. When the captains limped back to the docks in Liverpool, reporting that the torpedoes were somehow chasing them, Laidlaw and the team took this new terrifying data, and put it right back onto the chalk grid. They kept running simulations after simulations and eventually mapped out the turning radius of the acoustic torpedo. And within days, they engineered a brand new counter tactic called the step aside. Then they came up with a tactic called the fox out. They didn't stop there as well. As the war raged on, the Germans kept changing their tactics and the Wrens kept running their feedback loop over and over. They developed Operation Strawberry, Operation Pineapple, Operation Gooseberry. Yeah, they really seem to like their fruit. By the time the war ended in 1945, Room 66 had trained over 5,000 naval soldiers and played a big role in defeating the Nazis. This brings us to the 5 simple steps of applying systems thinking to our lives. Step 1 is gathering data. Gather data. Gather it from all the sources possible. If we keep running on preconceived assumptions, we might as well just end up dropping bombs on an empty ocean. Step 2 is to run a simulation. Don't just blindly trust the data. Run a simulation. Now there are frameworks for doing this depending on the situation, and I'll talk more about them in the upcoming videos, but here is the core principle. Just look for cohesion. Put all the data points you have gathered on a sheet of paper and see if they align. If A is true, is B also pointing in the same direction? Is C? If they all don't align, look for the inconsistency, the anomaly. If A, B and C are pointing in a direction, but D and E disagree, you have your first clue. Most problems come with a clue like this. There are rarely any perfect problems. Step 3 is to test your theory. If it works, great. If not, go back to the simulation. Step 4 is execution, but not blind execution. You need to run your solution along with step 5. Step 5, the feedback. And this is the most important step of them all. See, a feedback is the core difference between a rigid plan and an adaptive system. The problem with a plan is that it is often a set of instructions based on certain predictions. Now don't get me wrong, a plan is important and you do need certain predictions to get things moving along. But there is a limit to how much predictions you can make. A system solves this problem by getting constant feedback. When you get constant feedback, you can keep reiterating on your plan and moving forward. And that is important because we live in a world that is dynamic and keeps constantly changing. What you thought of as a perfect strategy today might as well just be destroyed tomorrow by an acoustic torpedo. That's it. Thanks for watching.